Welcome back to the Money Talk small group. I'm Callie Picardo, and this is my husband, Roz, and we've been diving into different ways to have your money communicate your love for the Lord and your love for your neighbor. And this week, we're looking at what does it mean to have your money say, spend me, rather than squander me. Now, the world's not going to, on the TV commercial or the ad you hear on Spotify, it's not going to say, come here and squander your money, great money pit opportunity. It's not going to say that. But often that's the invitation, is to spend more than you should on things you don't necessarily need to impress sometimes people you don't even like. So how do we line up our money to, instead of saying squander me, say spend me in a way that honors God?
Again, the founder of Methodism, John Wesley, he has taught so much about money in his sermons and writings, but he also grew up in hard circumstances. He was one of 19 children, which of course shaped his view of money because he pretty much lived in some sort of poverty. And not only that, but as John Wesley began to get into the ministry and start to practice what he was trying to preach and preach what he was trying to practice, he came across a situation that shaped his theology or his understanding of money. He was leaving a store where he was buying some pictures for his room, and he went into his house, and he had spent all his money pretty much on these furnishings when a chambermaid knocked on his door who was in poverty, and she was asking for money, for help. And John Wesley reached in his pockets and realized he didn't have hardly anything to give to her. Well, that was such a painful experience for John Wesley that he vowed from that day forward to change the way that he lived and he operated. He no longer was going to squander money anymore, but instead he would spend it wisely, and he would save, and he would do the things that God was ultimately calling him to do. He memorized the pain that day because it was such a painful experience, and he never wanted to deprive any human being of being able to meet their needs. So the way that he lived changed. At the beginning of his ministry, when he decided that he was going to try to save aggressively and be generous at the same time, he started out by pretty much collecting and living on 97 or 98% of his income while giving 2% away to the poor. By the end of his life, eventually, he was giving away 98% of his income and only living on 2%. Now, that was a gradual progression over the years, but he had to understand the difference between spending and squandering. Spending and squandering.
And that might sound crazy to you. Oh my goodness, how would you ever live off of only 2% and give the other 98% away? Well, it takes intentionality. And as God blessed him, as God raised that, he was able to do more. But there are some godly things to spend money on. And actually, the Bible talks about spending money on things that matter. So 1 Timothy 5:8 says, the one who doesn't take care of their own family is worse than an unbeliever. So taking care of the needs of your family, putting food on the table, a roof over the house, that's a priority and one that honors God. But then the challenge is when it starts being like, well, I need that new, latest, greatest. There's that advertising industry that's constantly pulling, constantly tugging, constantly trying to get us to part with those hard-earned dollars in a way that we may or may not need to. And I love what Paul says in Philippians chapter 4 about contentment. He says, I've known what it means to have a lot and a little. I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstance. And I love that word learn. It is not easy to be content, but it can be learned. So how do we learn that? I think it takes going to God over each purchase sometimes and saying, God, is this something I should spend my money on or not? I know some will do a 24-hour rule, especially for purchases over a certain threshold. If you're married, we encourage you to talk with your spouse and figure out, okay, what's that threshold over which we're going to talk before we spend money? Because often I see a spender gets married to a saver. Not all the time, but often that's the case. And there can be a lot of disputes over money, especially if someone's trying to save and the spender's always spending, or the saver's never letting the spender spend money. But God has not given your spouse to frustrate you, but to bless you. And so what does that look like to steward those resources together, to budget together, and to do it in a way that honors God?
We have to learn contentment. And so one of the questions that I ask myself, because I love stuff. Now, I love Apple products. I love trying to get the latest technology. I mean, that is one of my things that I just really like to have. But overall, with my purchases, I have to ask myself, would I purchase this item even if no one else ever saw it? And I was the only one that saw it.
That's convicting. Oh my goodness.
So let me ask that again. Would you buy what you buy if you were the only one that ever saw it? It might change your perspective, and it might help with the contentment factor versus the comparison factor, because oftentimes we look at our neighbors, we look at people around us and see what they have, and then we grow envious. And in order to keep up with the Joneses or the Kardashians, we overspend and not save and aren't good stewards.
Another way to get your spending to line up with God's word is actually to look at where your money goes. To look at your credit card bills, your bank statement, and where are the dollars actually going? And then take a minute and think, well, what are your values? As an individual, as a family, what are the things that you would say if someone said, what is the most important thing to you? What would you say? And then look at those budget numbers again. Look at those finances of where your money is going. Does it line up with your values? If it does, how can you shift it so that your finances do value what you reflect? They're putting God first, taking care of your family, and loving your neighbor. I love the story of Dr. Renee Lockey. I heard it years ago, and it's always stuck with me. She was an OBGYN, and she was saving aggressively. She was not married, no kids, and so she was able to put a lot of money away, and she was just aggressively saving. Until one day God said, I've got a different plan. Do you really trust me with all your finances? And she clearly heard God say, I want you to work like a doctor and live like a nurse. So she thought about it. Well, what would it look like to live like a nurse? What does the average nurse make? And so she set that as her spending, like that was the cap, and then everything above that she committed to giving away. It reduced the amount she was saving, but she was lining up her finances, her spending with a way that honored God. And the important thing here is your story is not my story, is not the story of the person sitting next to you, perhaps. What is God calling you to do with your finances? How is God calling you to honor the Lord with your spending? And starting with what you value and what God has put on your heart is a key spot to start when you do your budget. And yes, as I said budget. I know that makes a lot of people squirm, but think about it this way. If you don't budget, it's kind of like taking a big stack of you've had your money all in cash and just throwing it up in the air and hoping it lands where it's supposed to. A budget is simply putting your money where you want it to go. And if it doesn't work, if you try living under that budget for a while, you're tracking it and you're not able to live within that budget, figure out what adjustments need to be made. A budget is not set in stone. It changes by season to season. And if it doesn't work, you adjust it. It's not supposed to be a rigid, restrictive thing. It's supposed to be an intentional thing. And we want to live out our faith intentionally.
So the first thing in your budget when you're trying to craft it should be giving. We call this tithing in the church. We see the principle in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament. It's your first fruits, what they used to call back then. So it's almost like the harvest. You would bring your first fruits to God. And so before you pay any bill, before you save anything, you're saying, God, I want to place you first. And usually the benchmark to that is 10%. But what I tell people is if you're not tithing at all and God is saying, hey, I want you to give, test me in this very thing, you may want to start at 1%. You might grow every year. And if 10% is no big deal, then maybe God is calling you to increase that. So don't just stop yourself at 10%. Maybe God is saying, hey, I want you to go forward. But it's the only place in Malachi in the Old Testament that God says, test me in this. And so God is faithful. We know that when we give generously back to God, we are saying, God, I trust you, and I don't just trust you with this 10%. I trust you with 90%. I trust you 100%. So God, I want to place you and you alone first.
And then saving comes next. You do that saving systematically. And we talked about this in lesson 2 in the second week. And so if you missed that, go back and take a look. But what does it mean to save intentionally in a way that's not hoarding? But what is that percent you're going to save? And it might be that you have a percent you're saving off of your regular income. And then as an extra gift comes in, a side job comes in, if there's extra income from different things, maybe those go more intentionally towards saving or toward paying off debt. So that's another piece. So if you've got debt, is to work on getting free from debt so you can follow God's call wherever the Lord leads you. Proverbs compares being in debt as in being a slave to the lender. So what does it mean to get debt free? So your only master is the Lord himself, Jesus Christ, and so you can serve God fully. We've got some resources in the book. If you need some help with a debt repayment sheet, you can find some of those online too. But then intentionally work toward getting out of debt. And then finally, live on the rest. What is that remainder? And if you do those important things first, then the rest gets fit in where it needs to get in. And it might mean cutting out some things that are subscriptions or things that you're like, I know I love this, but can you go without it for several months? Maybe you try going out without something for a year to really accomplish some of your other financial goals and to get your finances back in line with what you value.
At the end of each session and each chapter, we ask you to go through this spiritual fruits inventory. And so you can do this on your own or in maybe a small group you're in right now. And the challenge is to take that inventory and reflect deeply. And maybe you want to share your findings with those around you. So take the time now